Hey, good morning. My name is Professor William Brown, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Centre for Multi-Level Modelling that's based at the University of Bristol. We are one of the partner groups with the National Centre for Research Methods of the ESRC, and as a result, we run training courses, but we're also creating training materials, online training materials and online training resources that you can use. Our speciality is multi-level modeling, which is a form of advanced statistical modeling that's used in the social sciences and more generally. And along with my colleague, Professor George Leckie, I'm going to talk to you today about an extension of multi-level models called cross-classified models. This is the introduction to this topic. We're going to have 3 lecture-style videos and then some walkthroughs of practicals. So if I carry on through the slides, what am I going to talk about in this first lecture? Well, the topic is cross-classified models, and so I'd like to give you some motivation about what are cross-classified models, when would you use them, and what applications might they be useful for. To do that, I want to recap a little bit on standard multi-level or nested models, so to give you an idea of where we're coming from, and then a little bit of history, how these models developed, before we move on to the example, which we will use in the practical materials, and just really talk a little bit about the application that the practical is based around, which is a data set from the field of education that's from a place called Fife in Scotland. Okay, I'll really just introduce that data set, and then that will be the end of this introductory lecture. And in lecture 2, my colleague George Leckie will take over, and he will fit models to that Fife data set. I'll then come back in lecture 3. Now, one feature of NCRM is that we are based in the social sciences, but we reach out to other disciplines, and that is certainly true with multi-level modeling. So I'm going to look at a couple of examples, a couple of extensions, if you like, to different application areas that actually expand the modeling. So we'll have more levels of more classifications that are crossed in these extended applications. So that will be lecture 3. And then, as I say, there will be practical materials. We will start off by running a practical using MLWin, and we may add, as time goes on, to those practical materials for different software packages. Okay, so let's start with a bit of background, a bit of revision probably for some of you. There were certainly materials on the NCRM repository on what we call multi-level modeling. A guy called Ian Brunton-Smith has given a whole series of lectures on that, but I'm just going to recap a little bit. So what are multi-level models? Well, really, all of our statistical models, these multi-level family of models, what they're designed to do is account for the underlying structure in the data set. They build on something called linear models, and types of linear models are things like regressions and analysis of variance. And these models tend to assume independence of the observations. Once you've put in the predictive variables, we assume that the observations are independent. So originally these multi-level models were developed for nested structures, and an example from education would be where we collected data on education. We generally want to collect, say, responses, maybe exam scores on pupils, and pupils, they don't hang around in fields, they go to schools, and so pupils are nested within schools. And so 2 pupils from the same school, we would expect to have the same educational experience and therefore to be more similar to each other than 2 randomly chosen pupils. Okay, so one way of thinking of this is that therefore what we need is an extension to our linear modeling, which will include some what we could call random effects to account for the fact that the pupils are nested within schools. Because the linear models assume independence, what would happen if you fit a linear model to data where there is this two-level structure is that you'd be too confident because you won't have controlled for the clusterings. You'll have assumed everything is fine, everything is independent, and your confidence in your results will grow, and you'll be overconfident. So we can write out, we're going to have a few equations here. We can write out a two-level model. Let me see if I can get my coloring pencil up here. So here is the model. Okay, I'll put a box around it. Okay. And we would normally have some sort of response variable of interest, which we will usually give the letter y. Okay. And we will have two indices here to indicate that that's an observation. Okay. And that's the yij is the response for the IF pupil, if in this education example. So I is pupils in the JAIF school. So J is schools. Okay, and then we have, this is almost like an extension of what we would call a regression model. So we have an intercept, beta 0, some predictor of interest, xij. Okay, so here xij is the predictor variable for the IF pupil in the JAIF school again, and the coefficient beta 1 that goes with the slope. So this could be, for example, an exam score at 16, yij could be, and xij could be some intake variable, maybe an exam score at age 11, and then we could see what progress was made through schools. Okay, and down here, this is the random part of the model. We've got a uj and an eij. So we've got what we call a uj here. This is the school random effect. It only has a j subscript, and the eij then is the residual, the pupil random effect, if you like. And to make this a multi-level model, we give distributional assumptions to both the u and the e. Okay, so we say that the school random effects have some variance that we're going to estimate, and the pupil random effects have some variance that we're going to estimate. And if we didn't have this uj, so if this wasn't in the model, this bit here, then we have a simple regression model. So by adding in those uj's, we've created this multi-level model, which allows for the controls for the clustering in the data. Now, as I say, pupils in schools, that's a typical example, but I mean, I could be cows and J could be herds. Okay, I used to work in a vet school, and we definitely had data on things like milk records, somatic cell counts for cows. So in that such scenario, you'd have cows nested within herds. But the important thing here is, irrespective of the application, the model and the methods that we use to fit it are exactly the same. So let me clear these drawings. I might do some more drawings as we go. And let's move on to the next slide then. Okay, so it might be easy to then therefore think about, let me just check that, yep, to think about how we might diagrammatically represent what's going on with our data. So in that last example where we had pupils within schools, we had what we would call a two-level model. The pupils were level 1, the schools were level 2. And here we see another two-level model, this one from geography. Okay, we might be collecting some information on individual people, but we also might know how they live. Okay, how they live might, where they live might influence their responses. They might be clustering due to geography. So here we have these 3 pupils here, 1, 2, and 3 are in the first area. These 2 pupils are in the second area, people are in the second area, and these 2 are in the third area. Okay, and we can draw this kind of these tree-like diagrams, and we can say, well, can we do more than that? Can we have more structures than these simple two-level structures? Now, it may turn out that actually we've got more geography than we thought. We may know the actual households of these people, And so we might introduce a free level structure. And here we're introducing a level household in between person and place. So these free people are actually the first household, and we've now got another couple of people who are in the same area, area 1, but belong to a different household, household 2. And over here we've got area 2, and now we've got the same first household we saw before, 1 and 2 here, okay, in that household. And here we have 4 individuals, that should be household 2. And then they're in area 2. Okay, so that's a natural structuring. That's how data might come across. You know, we've all recently had to fill in the census, and that census data would have information on each individual household. Okay, lots and lots of information about people in each individual household. And of course, households can naturally, just by getting a map and drawing area boundaries, can be put into various levels of geography. Okay, and we would expect actually some dependence here. We would expect people from the same household to be dependent, households in the same area to be dependent. You know, here they're sharing lots of things. They're sharing living space. In place, they might be sharing levels of deprivation, things like that. Okay, so let's clear off the drawings. So, we've really only so far touched on nested models, and that's not the topic of this talk. Okay, what we're interested in are cross-classified data structures. So here is an interesting data structure. Okay, this lines and dots kind of data structure that we have here. So here we have 12 individuals going from individual 1 on the left to individual 12 on the right. And this is our level which we've collected data. So we've collected data on individuals. And if we think of that example that we just looked at, maybe we know which neighborhood those individuals belong to. So again, we've got these 3 individuals in neighborhood 1, these 2 in neighborhood 2, these 3 in neighborhood 3, and these 4 in neighborhood 4. Okay, but maybe actually these individuals are school children. Okay, so school children, just like any other individuals, live in particular neighborhoods, but they also go to school. So we're back in that scenario that we looked at in our first motivating example. And maybe these 12 individuals actually go to 3 different schools: school 1, school, and school 3. But let's have a look at this. Which individuals are going to which school? So for school 1, we have individuals 1, 3, and 5. Okay, so you can see here, you can see the nested diagram there, these 3 lines joining school 1 to these 3 individuals. Then individuals 2, 4, 6, 7, and 10, they're all going to school 2. Okay, so again, we've got this sort of nested diagram with the lines. And individuals 8, 9, 11, and 12, they're all going to school 3. So one thing you can look at when you see this diagram is if you look at the neighborhood lines, the top half of this diagram, that's a nice little nested diagram. You know, you've captured 3 individuals here, and they've got nice straight lines going to neighborhood 1, neighborhood 2. When we come to the bottom, what we're seeing is the lines start crossing. Okay, so you can see this line is crossing with this line and this, and it starts looking a bit messy. And that's because what we can see is actually the children living in the same neighborhoods actually attend different schools. And flipping that over, schools draw students from several different neighborhoods. So we can't see, like in the last example where we had households, they were definitely nested within neighborhoods. Schools aren't nested within neighborhoods. They are crossed with each other. And that's why on the right-hand side here, if we're going to use this level terminology, these are effectively both level 2. Okay, individuals are definitely nested within schools. Individuals are definitely nested within neighborhoods, but schools aren't nested within neighborhoods and neighborhoods aren't nested within schools. So this is a cross-classified data structure. Okay, messy diagram, made even more messy by my pen drawing over it, which I'll clear now. Okay, but it's a real example, a real application. And we might say, well, you know, we've seen that from the first few slides, that actually data points that are in the same neighborhood, they could be clustered. Okay, they could have share things in common. They're sharing all those resources, the deprivation, etc. Data points in the same school, pupils in the same school, they share things in common and have the same teachers, you know, the same teaching experience maybe. So we need to control for those two different sources of clustering in our models. And they're not the only examples. The example which we'll look at actually in the practical is an education example. It's not quite the same as this. It looks at education over time. So what we have here is students, they're actually secondary school students, and they're doing an exam at the end of secondary school, but we have their history of education, really. So we have which primary school they attended and which secondary school they attended. And what we find is not every pupil from the same primary school goes to the same secondary school. Okay, so there is crossing going on between primary schools and secondary schools. We can also, in a similar context, maybe we took records of children on different time points. Maybe we have information on different exams, one every year. Okay, and in this scenario, where those exam marks will be nested within students and they will be nested within schools, but some children will swap schools during their career. So again, there'll be crossing going on there. We may also have, we've got lots of education examples here. We may be having scores being derived on students. This is a bit more like something like Strictly Come Dancing or something where we had raters. Raters are giving those scores, so you're being examined by a rater. Okay, it could be a marker actually if you think about it. And so different raters mark different papers and different students take different papers. So there'll be a crossing going on there. So there are lots of examples, and these are just free. We will see in part 3 of these lectures that you can have examples in different disciplines as well. Okay. So a bit of history. Where did the developments for these models come from? Well, many of the nested examples that we've seen so far, you know, pupils within schools, pupils within classrooms, they've come from the field of education. So as a result, lots of researchers, statisticians working in education developed software packages. MLWin, which is the one which we will use here, was developed by our center back in the 1990s. HLM was developed in the US and is still going as well. VARCL was another package in the 90s, which I think now is pretty much, it ran its course for a few years. And they were all developed with education examples in mind because of the natural hierarchy, students, classes, schools. Cross-classified models have a different history. And actually they appear more, the papers that developed some of the algorithms for these methods appeared more earlier in other fields, things like animal breeding. Because if you think about it, when you're doing animal breeding experiments, you're taking one male animal, one female animal, breeding them and seeing what happens. Okay, so you've got natural crosses of the males and the females. And one of the examples that I'll look up in lecture 3 is not animal breeding, it's natural data, but it is animals that are breeding, so it'll be birds in this case. But just a note here. So Robin Thompson and colleagues did a lot of pioneering work using restricted maximum likelihood methods, looking at these sorts of cross-classified models. Okay, so how do you estimate these models? We're going to come on to fitting some cross-classified models later, and they're more challenging to fit than nested models. So we're going to use Markov chain Monte Carlo methods, these simulation-based methods in the lecture and the practicals that we see, mainly because they've been implemented in the MLWin software that we're going to look at, but you can also, there were packages in R that will do it, in Stata, and things like WinBugs. And they're computationally efficient, they can handle big data sets, and they can do complex multiple membership models as well, which we'll look at in later lectures. Okay, so they're useful. Maximum likelihood estimators, well, you'll find maximum likelihood estimators for multi-level models in most software packages these days, but usually they've been designed to fit hierarchical models. What they do is they use what we call sparse matrix techniques. So they use the fact that the variance matrix in these models is sparse, it's block diagonal in some sense, to make it easier to fit the models. One exception being the R package. So LME4 is very good at fitting cross-classified models. It has no problems with them. And there are some elegant papers. So the paper by Razbash and Goldstein in 1994 show clever solutions to recast cross-classified models as some sort of constrained hierarchical model. And this was done originally in MLWin, in Nichols. It's also available, I believe, in the Stata Mixed package as well. And these work particularly well in examples like the one we'll see in the practical, where things are almost nested. There's just, primary school and secondary school. In our example, they're not nested, but there are almost like feeder primary schools. So lots of pupils do indeed go from the same primary school to a particular secondary school, but there is some element of cross classification. It works to a certain degree, but it's cumbersome if you've got big data sets or if you have multiple membership models that we'll deal with later. Okay, so that's a little note on estimation. Let's talk about the example that George will take you through most of the model fitting with. And this is an example from Fife, which is an area of Scotland, the north of the UK, for those of you from elsewhere. And it's been used in many places. Razbash and Goldstein back in 1994 used it originally when they were showing off their extensions of the Eccles algorithm that I just talked about for cross-classified models. So it's a reasonable size data set. We've got 3,435 data points. And these are students, and as I said earlier, this is exam scores at the end of secondary education. So in the UK, what we have is primary and secondary education, and then tertiary education and university. So primary education is from the ages of about 4 to 11. Secondary education is from 11 to 16. And then there's this area between 16 and 18, which sort of fits in. It's called sixth form. It fits in, it might be tertiary education in some settings. It's the pre-university years, then university from 18 onwards. So what we have is a score at age 16. Okay, and we've got a lot of pupils. They come from pretty much all of the secondary schools in Fife. In this data set, 19 secondary schools, a small number of secondary schools, 148 primary schools. And that's typical in the UK education system, where primary schools are usually closer to where people live, and maybe have 1 or 2 classes. So you may only have 30 students in a year in a primary school. Secondary schools then, they're bigger schools and they take students from a wider area. So you have often primary schools that are feeders to secondary schools. So that's the nature of the data set. The response is actually an attainment score, total attainment score, and it ranges from 1 to 10. Okay, so we're going to do we're going to assume these scores are normally distributed. or at least the residuals in the models we fit are normally distributed. But it's worth noting that, of course, this is actually an integer score, so everybody gets a score from 1 to 10 on their attainment at age 16. And there are lots of student level predictors, things that might influence the score. So for each of these pupils, we know how well their mother and their father did in education. We do have a score, an earlier score, a verbal reasoning score, which I think was taken at age 11. We have this variable called choice of schools. So at the time, this is quite old data, as you can imagine, given it was analysed in 1994. At the time, in Scotland, you were allowed to fill in a form which said which school you'd want to go to, which secondary. And then depending on spaces, you'd be allocated to a secondary. So this choice of school would be 1 if you got your first choice, 2, etc. We have some measure of social class, and we have the gender of the child. And these can then be used to explain what we see in terms of variation in attainment. Okay, so let's look at what the data looks like. So what we've done here, this is just actually a randomly sampled 8 students from 2 of the secondary schools, schools 1 and 2. So what we see is I've sorted this data by secondary school, just at the small subsample. So we've got these first 4 pupils in secondary school 1, these next 4 are in secondary school 2, and primary school varies as we go down. So these first 2 are in primary 1, these next 2 are in primary 2, these first 2 are in primary 12, oops, sorry, and the last 2 are in primary 14. So actually these 8 points are actually a nested data structure with primary nested or in secondary. But what you would find if I put the whole data set there is that you'll see some of these number 1s here appearing lower down for a different school. Okay, so it isn't really nested data. Okay, primary, but to a large degree it's close to nested data. So some of these primaries will feed the secondaries. Okay, we've got the pupil number here. These are just the numbers that we've given to each pupil. We've got their scores. So this first pupil scored 9, the next one 6. Their verbal reasoning score from age 11. How well their mother did in education. Okay, so this is just a binary, whether they went past a particular level. So a 1 would be had higher education than a 0. Okay, and then the choice of secondary school. So 7 of these 8 children got their first choice. This child here got their second choice of secondary school. So didn't really want to go to secondary school 2, but that was the one they were allocated to. So a little bit of a point here. In a cross-classified data structure, what we really need is we need unique identifiers for the classifications. Okay, so when it says primary 1 here, that is the first primary school. Now, when you have nested, repeated levels of nested, you might have the first primary school in secondary school 1 and the first primary school in secondary school 2, and they might be different schools. Here, because we're treating cross-classified models, these have to be unique. Okay, so that gives us some motivation for the data. We've got a few predictors here, and you can see the format that we require for our data set. Let's just do some preliminary looking at the data set. So what I've done here is I've worked out the average score in attainment for each pupil, for each higher level unit. So on the left-hand side here, we have the secondary schools. On the right-hand side, with the primary schools. So we've got our 19 secondary schools, and we can see that the average attainment, if I draw these lines, just about, lies between about 7, below there, and 4. Okay, so there's a little bit of spread. This school here seems to be a bit of an outlier. It's a bit low. This school here seems to be doing the best of the bunch. Okay, when we compare that with the primary school, bearing in mind that the secondary school, there were lots of pupils per secondary school, and for primary school, there were probably less. There is much more variability. Okay, so we've got one here where everybody got 10, and down here we've got a few which are down about 2. So we see that variability going on there. So that's quite interesting. So when we've actually fit models, we might expect the variance of the primary school to be bigger than the variance of the secondary school, and we might think that's a more important predictor. Where you went to primary school might be a more important predictor than where you went to secondary school in defining how well you'll do. Okay, and one more thing to look at with the data. Let's do a quick cross classification of cross tabulation, sorry, of primary schools by secondary schools. So what I've done here, let me get my pencil. Up the top here, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 primary schools, 10 I've just chosen, and 4 of the secondary schools. Now, this is part of a much bigger matrix, much bigger table. I've just put this bit to give you some idea of what's going on. So we can see for these 4 schools at least, primary school 1, 45 pupils, and they all go to secondary school 9. Primary school 2, well, all 7 of them are going to school 7. Primary school 4, here we have a bit of a difference, okay? So most of the pupils go to school 9, but one of them goes to school 6. And we can see similar things if we come across. These have all got one secondary, 1 primary, okay? Then we've got 1 pupil who's going to number 8 when the rest of his or her peers are going to number 6. And here's one with more split, okay? 15 going to 6, 1 going to 7, 4 going to 8. So what you've got to realize is some of this will be geography. So some primary schools will be close to the boundary between 2 secondary schools, and some of it will be choice. So we can see that secondaries are drawing their students from many different primaries, and primaries are sending their children to different secondary schools. We've got examples of that, though many of them are what I would call feeder schools, where the bulk of those children go to 1 secondary. So we're not far away from nested models. In actual fact, we'd call this data sparse because you can see that lots of the cells here are empty. Now, this is very different from some cross-classified examples that you might see where that's not the case. So how cross-classified in practice are these data? Well, so if we looked at them from a secondary school perspective, then the one secondary school we could find has only 7 primary schools that are giving it all of its pupils, whereas the one which has the most variety has 32 of the primary schools giving its pupils. Okay, but never 148. 32 of them is the most we've got to send into 1 secondary. So of the 148, what we find is that, again, they don't send them up to all 19 different secondary schools. They actually send to between 1 and 6. Okay, in actual fact, 57, so over a third of the primary schools are simply a subset of pupils that go to the secondary. So all those pupils go to the same secondary. Another 50 of them, so we know well over half, are split between 2, 26 between 3, and then we've got the tail. There are 15 primaries there that go 4, 5, or 6. Okay. So we do have this feeder school. So really, what if we were looking at this as a system? Really, it's a bit of a feeder schooling system. Okay, so there is this natural idea of primaries sending on to secondaries, and so all of the same factors of geography and underlying deprivation, etc., will persist in both primary and secondary, rather than, say, a school choice system where kids are moving lots and lots. In actual fact, if I was to move 8.4% of students, right, take them, pick them up and put them into the the main secondary school for their primary school, I could create a strict hierarchy. Okay, so it's cross classified data, but it's not hugely cross classified. Okay. So that's introduced the data set, and I think that's a natural point to stop. And what I will do is I will hand over to George Leckie in the second example, where now that you've second lecture, now that you've got an idea of this Fife in Scotland data set, you can see how we might fit some models to explain the variation that we see in education. So what I've covered in this first lecture is I've done some recap. Okay, so I've recapped the ideas of multi-level models in general, and then shown, just by showing you these line and dot diagrams, shown that not all data structures have this hierarchical or nested data structure. I've given you a little bit of historical background and a little bit about estimation of these models, and then we've begun to introduce an example from educational research, and this example has a cross-classified structure. As I say, George will now take over, and in the second lecture we're going to fit some models to this structure, and then we'll finish with that example, and I'll return in the third lecture and I'll introduce some extensions and additional applications. So I hope that was a straightforward introduction. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to speaking to you in the third lecture.